This week we're looking at fixing colour issues and matching shots with colour correction. Hello, my name is Cade and this is DSLRguide. So this mini-series is all about how I work with colour, which is slightly different to the traditional method, but I'll talk a lot more about that later on. So if you've seen last week's video, you know that we were talking about colour grading, and there's a link in the description if you haven't seen that video yet. But this week we're talking about the hugely important process of matching your shots and fixing any problems. So if you've set your white balance wrong, or maybe if your lights have a colour cast that you don't really want, you know, how do we get it so that your scene plays out smoothly without one shot that kind of sticks out as having too much green in the skin tones, for example. So let's take a look at the first example. So here we have a graded shot from a music video I've been working on. Now pay attention to the colour of the grass as we go into the next shot. So obviously this grass is a lot less yellow, so to fix this, the first thing I'll do is put the clip on top of the other clip that we want to match it to. And then I'll go over to my colour panel and grab the colour mask tool. Now all of the standard editors, whether it's Adobe or Sony Vegas, they should all be able to do exactly what I'm doing in this video. Colour correction really doesn't need any fancy software. So I'm selecting some of the green, the idea being that we want to change the colour of the grass but not the skin tones or the blue gown. So now if I go over to my colour wheel, I'll just add a whole bunch of red to the highlights so we can see what the mask is doing. And then I'll adjust this slider, which basically controls the feathering of the mask. So next we'll get rid of that red tint, and I'm actually going to crop the image to the right so that we can see the other shot behind it. So now when we grab our highlights and move it around, we can clearly see how close we are to matching the shots. So in this case, I want to add some orange to the highlights, and then I'm going to actually drop the saturation quite a lot. So next I'll go back and I'll tweak the highlights again, and then finally I'll just boost the shadows a bit. So I'm absolutely fine with the way that the grass is still darker in the second shot. And now if I play the clips one after another, I think they match pretty seamlessly. And that's what the grass looked like before our correction. Okay, so in our next shot, you can clearly see that I've set the white balance wrong. The image is far too orange. So I'll grab my circle mask tool just like in the grading episode last week, and I'll scale it down and position it over the face. This allows us to use the vector scope to analyze just the skin tones alone. So looking at our vector scope on the left, you can see that they are pointing towards yellow, and we want them to be directly on that line, which is called the skin tone indicator. So I'll grab my highlights and I'll move them all over the place just so you can see how this affects the vector scope. And as I move it to blue, we can see the skin tones sit right on that line. So that's a lot better. It still looks pretty warm because of the yellow walls of the room, but it's certainly a lot more accurate than it was before. So next I wanted to demonstrate how I'd match shots that were filmed on different cameras. So I got out my cheap point and shoot camera, the Canon Ixus 220HS. Now because that camera doesn't have manual exposure control in video mode, it got the exposure completely wrong. So let's see how close we can get the shots to look. So again, I'll put the clip on top of the one we want to match it to, and I'll open the waveform this time. And again, I'm going to crop the close-up to the right, and then I'll move the wide shot to the left so that we can see the guitar in both shots. Now I'll bring the shadows down a bit, but I like to let the midtones handle most of the contrast. So as I do this, I'm paying a lot of attention to the waveform on the left. We can see that now our shadows are sitting right above that zero line for both shots. So looking at the two images, I definitely need to drop the saturation of the close-up, and then again I'm going to look at my waveform, and I can see that I need to drop the highlights a bit as well. Okay, so now our levels are set pretty well. If we look at the dark parts of the guitar, I think it's got too much red, so I'm going to actually add a little bit of green into the shadows. Then I'll move the highlights around. In this case I needed to actually cool it down a bit. So now when we play the shots together, I think they match pretty well, especially considering that we used a very cheap camera and totally screwed up the exposure. Now this next shot isn't too bad to begin with, but the light was changing every 5 minutes because the sun was going down, which made it very hard to set a white balance. So if I grab another circle mask and position it over the skin tones, first we can see that on our waveform it's sitting right around 75, which I'm very happy with. Anything between 50 and 75 for skin tones is pretty good as far as I'm concerned, unless of course you're going for a certain look in your grade. But switching to the vector scope, we can see that actually we're too far towards yellow, and there's a bit of green in there too. So this is a pretty easy fix. I'll just add some purple into the highlights. Again, I'll check the vector scope and we can see that I've went too far in this case. So then I'll tone it down a bit, and there we go, it's right on the indicator line. So the last thing to do is to shut off that circle mask and then compare it with the original. So we can now see that our skin tones are neutral, and when we switch back to the old one you can really see how yellow-green that tint was. Okay, so hopefully that's cleared up some of the questions that you guys had about the difference between grading and correction. Obviously, traditionally you would do color correction first and then do your grading afterwards, but because I use Film Convert, which kind of does, it sets the levels and does the grade kind of at the same time. So for that reason, I do it first, but of course you've got to do whatever works for you. You might find that neutralizing your clips and then adding the grade works best for you, and that's absolutely fine. And of course the other thing is that if you set your exposure and your white balance right, if you use a grey card for example, you can be really precise, and then you don't really have to worry about correction in terms of fixing any problems. You can just go straight into the grade and copy it across all your clips and it should match up perfectly. So yeah, that's it for this week. I would like to say actually that on the blog post I've linked to a whole bunch of videos that have really inspired me and taught me a lot about colour, so do check out those on the blog post again, link in the description. That's it for this week, and I'll see you next time.